Hello, my name is Ann Lipton, and I'm a professor and Laurence W. DeMuth Chair at Colorado Law School. And I want to start by thanking you, Peter, for inviting me to speak today on such an important topic, which is how we should think about corporate sustainability disclosure. And when I say sustainability disclosure, I mean all the information that goes under the umbrella of ESG, environmental impacts, relationship with labor, consumers and local communities, board processes, legal compliance, and so forth. And for the purposes of this discussion, I'll specify that I'm talking about mandatory disclosure, not disclosures the company voluntarily offers. So I'll begin by asking, what is the purpose of corporate disclosure in general? Why do we require such a thing? Well, the only way to answer that question is to first ask, who's the audience? Who do you imagine is reading your disclosure? In America, that audience is investors. It's for an investor audience. Why? Because under American law, there's really only one vehicle for imposing any kind of holistic public disclosure on a business, and that's the federal securities laws. We have other areas of law that require targeted disclosure of particular items of interest for non-investor audiences, like individual plants might have to disclose emissions, individual work sites might have to disclose safety information. But the only source of holistic corporate disclosure obligations in America, the only area of law that requires corporations to offer a complete picture of their operations, comes from the federal securities laws. And there's no question that investors need this information. They obviously need hard financial data, but they probably need at least some sustainability information as well. After all, if the company is breaking the law, there might be penalties, and that's expensive, and that matters to investors. If the company is failing to adjust to a changing climate, then its assets are going to be damaged, its supply chains disrupted. That too is expensive and matters to investors. But investors are not the only audiences that benefit from corporate disclosure. For example, regulators. Regulators use corporate disclosure to gain an understanding of economic activity in various sectors and to identify red flags of illegal conduct. Competitors use corporate disclosure. They use it to understand industry best practices and benchmark their own operations and to see how much to invest and what to invest in. Counterparties who contract with the corporation use corporate disclosure. Lenders and suppliers may use it to decide whether to extend credit and on what terms. Employees may use it to get a sense of how healthy the company is and whether they should stay or look for another job. Employees have sometimes actually declared a strike because they figure, given profit reports, the company can afford to pay them more. More broadly, disclosure serves as a basic tool of social control of corporate behavior. Disclosure gives the general public insight into corporate operations. Armed with information, the public or NGOs or journalists can identify antisocial or unethical behavior. They can publicize it. They can organize protests. And corporate boards know all of this. They know that if they're subject to a holistic disclosure regime like the American securities laws, bad behavior will be revealed. So they're incentivized to keep an eye on operations and try to prevent wrongdoing so they don't have to lie about it and put themselves at legal risk. In other words, disclosure, holistic general disclosure about firm operations, can be really important to society as part of the project of constraining corporations to ensure that their profit-seeking activities are channeled in a pro-social direction. Without insight into corporate behavior, non-investor groups may have few avenues of influence, and they're at the mercy of corporate profit-seeking that might turn out to be exploitative or harmful. And it turns out the American securities laws, in a way, have their roots in this intuition. Back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, when we first saw the rise of giant corporations in America, there were a lot of calls for comprehensive schemes of federal corporate regulation, many of which included disclosure to the public as a key feature. And at that time, advocates made exactly the arguments I just made about why public disclosure was important. And corporatist types were actually in some ways very supportive of disclosure as a form of regulation because they thought it was relatively light touch as compared to the other options. But then they adopted a kind of divide and conquer strategy. They would argue it was fine to require disclosures to investors specifically because investors needed information when deciding whether to invest, and it was fine to require disclosure to the government, which could be kept confidential so the government could police corporate law breaking and learn enough about industry to develop new regulation. But after that, they argued there was no need for further disclosure just to the citizenry. And that argument kind of carried the day, which is how you wind up with the federal securities laws as a compromise position. We won't require disclosure to the general public, but we'll require it for investors, and the rest of society can still see it and use it. In the 1970s, the same thing happened. There was an explosion of corporate scandals, corporate bribery scandals, consumer safety scandals, environmental scandals. And so there was a new call for comprehensive federal reform. And those calls included demands for disclosure to the public, this time of corporate social performance, diversity data, environmental performance, taxes paid, political contributions. And that also failed, but not entirely, because the American Securities and Exchange Commission expanded disclosure requirements of these matters for investors only. So the rule became, well, corporations don't have to disclose diversity data for the public, but they do have to disclose material risks. So if there's a risk of a lawsuit, of a government enforcement action, that has to be disclosed. So the demand for disclosure to the public failed, but that same kind of information ended up being disclosed after a fashion to investors. Today, I think this compromise, disclosure for investors but available to non-investors, I think it's become increasingly untenable. And that's because investor audiences are systematically different from non-investor audiences. First and most fundamentally, investors and non-investor audiences may care about different companies. Today, private companies, that is non-public companies, dominate important sectors of the economy. In America, over the past 30 years, Congress and the SEC have made it very, very easy for entrepreneurs to raise capital privately by tapping sophisticated investors who are presumed not to need the benefits of mandatory disclosure. So we have private equity, venture capital pouring billions of dollars into companies that have no disclosure obligations to investors and therefore none to the public at large. But these companies may be extremely important to society. I mean, think today about artificial intelligence being developed in private firms that we know very little about. So that's one reason why a disclosure system designed for investors won't really meet the needs of the general public. Investors may require information about different companies than the public does. Second, investor and non-investor audiences require different types of information. Now, for sure, there are some investors who combine financial and non-financial goals, but I think we can safely say that for most investors, financial goals are paramount. Investors want information so they can maximize their returns. But non-investors aren't just interested in corporate profit potential. Regulators want to study economic trends and identify violations of the law. Activists want to identify unethical behavior and organize campaigns to stop it. Employees want a bargaining advantage so they can strike better deals. Which means non-investor audiences want information, sustainability information, double materiality information that goes beyond what's relevant to the financial bottom line. An investor-oriented system doesn't provide the key metrics of social performance that the public demands. And the third problem with relying on an investor-oriented disclosure system is that the public operates on a different scale than investors do. We have a lot of really big companies right now, and some of their subsidiary operations may be small compared to the company overall, but large in absolute terms. Investors may not care about these operating subsidiaries because their overall effect on corporate performance is minor, but the public wants to know because they have outsized effect on people's lives. Instagram, for example, it's an incredibly important platform socially, but it's a subsidiary of Meta, and Meta only reports its results folded in with other products like Facebook and WhatsApp. Same with Waymo at Google. The point being, the informational needs of the public are not coextensive with the informational needs of investors. Additionally, and now remember, I'm talking about the U.S. specifically, I think filtering the needs of the public through the securities laws has had some perverse effects. First, it encourages a fundamentally dishonest sort of conversation. The public wants all this social information, this sustainability information, but there's no real mechanism for getting it except through the securities laws. So that means whenever an advocacy group or even a member of Congress decides they want some piece of information, they try to come up with some kind of argument for why this information is relevant to investors, even when the connection is pretty attenuated. But more generally, when disclosure is only for investors, it gives investors a special influence over corporate operations that other constituencies can't match. Rather than making corporations more responsive to the general public, disclosure aimed only at investors ends up making investors more powerful in the corporate polity. It limits the conversation. We're only talking about the kind of information that investors need and not what society needs. And I think that all by itself is sort of pernicious. It suggests that investors are the only constituency that matters. And that distorts our thinking about corporate purpose and whether corporations owe duties to anyone but their own investors. I also think it induces a kind of mindset in corporate managers as well. If they're only reporting for investor audiences, they think of themselves as beholden only to that constituency. But what happens if we look outside of America? I'm sure probably everyone listening to this knows Europe recently did something extraordinary. It adopted the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, which requires all companies doing business in Europe to make basic public disclosures if the company is large enough to make a social impact. Under the European system, if the company actually trades in Europe, there are disclosures aimed at investors. But whether it trades or not, there are also disclosures geared for the general public. This system almost can't be understood in American terms. Like, I've heard some Americans say that the only reason non-European companies are subject to the CSRD, companies that don't trade in Europe, is to kind of even the regulatory playing field between European and non-European companies. No, no, that's not why. I don't pretend to know the minds of regulators. Maybe some were thinking that, but conceptually, that's not the reason. The reason non-European companies are subject to the CSRD is because they have operations with sufficient societal impact that the general public should be made aware of their activities. I've seen Americans compare the CSRD to sustainability accounting standards like those under SASB. No, completely different. SASB is for investor audiences and the CSRD is not. The fact is, though, the CSRD is kind of a grand experiment. It's very new. It's just coming online right now, and there are already efforts underway to pare it back. There have been a lot of complaints that it imposes too high a burden on companies, especially smaller companies that can't afford the expense of compliance. So there are proposals in the works to limit the information that companies will be required to disclose, and also to limit the number of companies that will be subject to disclosure obligations in the first place. Which means the fate of the CSRD and whether it will have any effects, good or ill, is yet to be determined. Now, I personally don't have any particular intuitions about whether the current CSRD goes too far, whether the criticisms of it are fair, what the right amount of disclosure is in any absolute sense. I'm going to leave the details to others to flesh out. But the CSRD conceptually represents something important. It represents a kind of democratizing of influence within the corporation. The CSRD makes the expressive point that all of society is entitled to know about and have input into private businesses, which are, as a practical matter, critical centers of economic power. The CSRD says, if a legislative directive could speak, that it's not just investors, not just shareholders who have a right to weigh in on corporate decisions. It's not even just elected representatives. Instead, the people themselves have a fundamental right to understand how and why power is being exercised over their lives. They're entitled to understand the processes that led to that exercise, who stands to benefit, and they're entitled to organize to influence that power. That said, I think it's safe to observe that we are currently in a historical moment when the notion of democratizing anything is not exactly in vogue. Instead, there seem to be some powerful movements to centralize power in unaccountable leaders. And we're seeing that impulse across both business and politics. Ordinary administrative processes, which are usually thought to be valuable because they contribute to transparency and objectivity, are now being treated as unnecessary and hobbling. So when we see, as we're seeing now, businesses object to something like the CSRD, I ask, how much of that is part of the usual pushback that business always offers to any kind of new regulation? And how much of it is more a fundamental objection to what the CSRD represents in terms of how it envisions the allocation of power throughout society? And that, I think, is the story that's currently being written. Thank you.